In today's video, we will look at another ship known mostly for her sinking, a ship best known as a historical footnote in the escalating tension of 1941. USS Reuben James, the first American destroyer, lost to a German U-boat, before the United States and Germany were formally at war, an unfortunate consequence of an undeclared conflict, of pushing the Neutrality Patrol further and further out, a probably unavoidable consequence in the end. I will, of course, cover that in this video, but I'll also look at the rest of her service, quiet as it may have been. It's an interesting story in its own right, especially considering the usual pattern for a four-stacker destroyer. For Reuben James, that story began on April 2nd, 1919, as part of the massive order of destroyers to build up the fleet during the Great War, something that continued even after the war ended. As part of this massive buildup, shipyards pumped these ships out at a frantic pace. Reuben James would be launched on October 4th, 1919, just a few months after she was laid down, in this case by New York Shipbuilding. Although things did slow down after the launch, with the ship commissioned on September 24th of 1920. Where Reuben James sticks out from her sister ships is in her service. She actually remained in active duty for most of the interwar period. A large portion of the Wicks and Clemson class ships spent their time in reserve, only being pulled out to replace worn-out sister ships. Not so with Reuben James, as we'll see. Although before that, we need to look at the design. We'll begin naturally with the displacement. Clemson-class destroyers displaced around 1,200 tons, with this ranging as high as 1,300 at the higher end. This displacement allowed for a heavy weapons load, especially for 1919, consisting of 4 4-inch guns for the main battery, one mounted on the bow, one on the stern, and the other 2 on an amidships gunhouse. Those guns, meanwhile, were backed up by a single 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, of dubious utility even when first designed. Individual ships would also carry a mix of machine guns. The real bite, however, came from the torpedoes, 12 21-inch tubes carried in 4 triple mounts. These were staggered along the amidships section of the ship, with 2 mounts to a side. The ship also carried a pair of depth charge racks on her stern. All of this equipment could reach around 35 knots on 27,000 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts. And with that brief detour done, let's return to the service. As previously stated, this began in late 1920. Of course, at this point, we're into the generally quiet time that was the 1920s. For most ships, this would be a boring time without much to speak of. This is also true to some extent for USS Reuben James. However, the ship does have some notable events, and that began right out of the metaphorical gate. On November 30th, 1920, Reuben James left home. She sailed across the Atlantic towards Yugoslavia, arriving there on December 18th to take up position on her new duty, as part of the destroyer detachment for American naval forces in Europe. Reuben James would remain in this role, based out of Yugoslavia, for the early part of 1921. It admittedly consisted mostly of patrols or helping out refugees, but it was a fairly unique duty. Until it came to an end in September 1921 with the closing of the bases. In doing so, Reuben James became the last American warship to leave the Adriatic on September 29th of 1921. The next major event for the ship would be just as interesting. Reuben James, alongside USS Olympia, was in France on October 21st, 1921, for the formal transfer of the unknown soldier. The destroyer would not, however, go home with that body. Instead, Reuben James moved to the Baltic, specifically to Danzig, to support the American Relief Administration. Nothing particularly notable happened here, or when the ship returned to the Mediterranean in early 1922. So with her duties in Europe done, USS Reuben James set sail for New York on July 17, 1922. Once home, the destroyer took up the usual peacetime duty, training and patrols for the most part. This would last the remainder of the 1920s, with a couple notable exceptions. For example, on October 2, 1926, Reuben James left New York Navy Yard to help take video of SS Leviathan, that being the ex-German liner Vaterland. This was a nice event. 1927, however, would open up with a less fortunate note. Reuben James and her sister ship, USS Lawrence, had to dock at Hampton Roads on January 8, 1927. Both ships had 6 sailors with a particularly bad strain of influenza. Fortunately, this didn't spread much beyond those men. That allowed Reuben James to leave on January 15th, in this case to take up duty off Nicaragua to try and catch gunrunners. The country was suffering from political instability at the time, and this kept the destroyer in the area until March 15th. After this, it was back to a rotating period of training and port visits. That would last until Reuben James was decommissioned on January 20th, 1931. Now, for many four-stackers, that might have been where her story ended. It would not be the case for this ship. After a short stint in reserve, Reuben James was recommissioned on March 9th, 1932. More of a short break in service than a proper stint in reserve. That said, not much really changed for USS Reuben James in the 1930s. There was a slight bit of excitement from September 1933 to January 1934. This saw Reuben James off the coast of Cuba during and after the 1933 Revolution, also known as the Sergeant's Revolt. While certainly an eventful period in Cuban history, there wasn't much for Reuben James to do. So the destroyer left in early 1934 for a short training stint in the Atlantic before then moving on to the Pacific in October 1934. She arrived in San Diego on November 9th and would remain in the Pacific for the next few years, although nothing of major note happened during this period. Reuben James would return to the Atlantic in January 1939. This initially continued the pattern of training, at least through the summer. By August, however, the ship was scheduled for a conversion into a seaplane tender destroyer. Several other four-stackers would go through this conversion, although Reuben James ended up missing it. Her conversion was supposed to begin on August 29th, 1939. If you know your history, you can probably guess why this didn't happen. A couple days later, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. As a result, Reuben James had her conversion canceled on September 12th. She was then assigned to the Neutrality Patrol instead. Initially, even this was uneventful. Reuben James would patrol out of Norfolk and then Key West to watch for either surface raiders or German U-boats, with a break to escort USS Ranger on October 28th. Nothing major happened during this early period, with the exception of November 30th, 1939. On that day, Reuben James ran aground off Cuba. This actually saw, among other things, Ranger come to her assistance. The carrier and her crew helped offload weaponry and other equipment to lighten Reuben James. These efforts, combined with other vessels showing up to help, saw the destroyer refloated. On December 1st, Reuben James set sail for Charleston. She would arrive on December 5th, where her damage was examined. It was evidently severe enough to require sailing for the New York Navy Yard. and a refit that would last until June 3rd, 1940. Although Reuben James only really returned to service in August of 1940. Trials and further refits kept her busy from June through July. The remainder of 1940 and early 1941 continued to be largely quiet after that refit. Things would only get exciting again in mid-1941. On March 1st, the support force was created. This was used for escorting British convoys as far out as Iceland. Reuben James was just one of 18 old destroyers assigned to this duty. Her initial service didn't see her stick out much. The destroyer would sail up and down the east coast until sailing for Iceland on September 6, 1941. This first voyage saw some excitement when a submarine was sighted on the surface in foggy weather. The other destroyers in the formation proceeded to depth charge the boat after it crash dived. Reuben James was, however, not involved in that process. After that point, the rest of the voyage was pretty uneventful. However, the ship's luck would run out on her second voyage to Iceland. On October 23, 1941, Reuben James joined up with other ships to escort convoy HX-156. This was more dangerous than it may have seemed. A few days before, USS Kearney had been torpedoed on October 17th. Fortunately not sunk, but it was an ominous sign. Still, this convoy escort went well at first. There were a couple submarine scares, one of which involved Reuben James depth charging a contact on October 30th. However, no debris or anything else was seen. The next day, a submarine would show up. On the early morning of October 31st, 1941, U-552 sighted the convoy. Under the command of Eric Topp, the boat fired 2 torpedoes. These hit Reuben James on the port side, blowing the bow apart. USS Reuben James sank almost immediately, with the stern section lingering for only 5 minutes before going under. The sinking was so fast and the damage so severe that only 44 men would survive, out of 144 aboard the ship at the time. Not one officer would survive. That included the captain, one Lieutenant Commander Haywood L. Edwards, the namesake of USS Haywood L. Edwards, which I recently covered. Thus ends the story of USS Reuben James. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.